Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio In, and today we are going to be taking a look at two budget IEMs. We've got the CCA Trio and the TRN ST7. Now, of course, in order to try to keep the video from going too long, I am going to do more of a mini review, so to speak, of each set. So of course, I'll do my absolute best to cover all of the main points so you can hopefully at least have enough information to determine if either of these sets might be for you. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. We'll start with the least expensive set first, which is the CCA Trio. That's priced at $30. So of course, it is kind of to be expected to have a pretty simple presentation and not much in the way of accessories. They basically just give you the IEMs, cable, and then a small selection of ear tips. And they do not provide a case. Now, as far as the build and design, it doesn't necessarily look or feel cheap, but it does still strike me as generally having more of a budget presentation. So they've used budget materials, but the build does seem pretty solid at least enough to hold up pretty well with normal use. It's held up okay for me. And as far as the driver setup, it has 3 dynamic drivers. Now, of course, CCA is closely associated with KZ, and there has been controversy surrounding KZ in the past regarding whether or not some of the drivers are even functioning or being used in some of their multi-driver sets. I'm not saying I have any reason to believe that's the case with this set, but I also don't typically tear sets apart and test their components. All I do is tell you what I think of the sound. And you know what? This might be one of the better sounding CCA releases that I've come across. Granted, I haven't heard all of their sets, and I also don't own many KZ sets either. I own a lot of budget sets, but not necessarily CCA or KZ sets. Now, this does have 4 switches on the back of the shells, which basically only affects the bass levels as far as I can tell. So it does not affect the upper mids and treble. It might affect the lower mids a little bit. So you have lots of options, but for time's sake, I'm only going to briefly talk about the switch position that I felt worked best for me. And just to be clear, I don't particularly like switches, but I have to be honest, this implementation isn't really that bad. And the position that sounded the most balanced, and I guess the closest to my preference, was with the first 3 switches up and then the 4th switch down. So again, that position sounded the most balanced to my ears, and it also seemed to offer the best separation between the mids and the bass. And it does have what I would consider to be more of a neutral presentation with a little bit of a bass boost. Now, I also liked it with all of the switches in the up position because the bass separation was also pretty good, but it was a little too thin sounding in the lower mids and mid bass, very similar to what was going on with the Moondrop variation. So I just ended up settling on the up, 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 down position because it still had good bass separation, but it also filled out the lower mids and mid bass a little better as well. Dynamics and impact were also decent, although not great. My guess is it's probably because it's an 8mm driver. Extension is also pretty good. Now, surprisingly, while it does have good bass separation, it still doesn't offer much in terms of texture. And then as you move into the mid-range, although I didn't really pick up on any major issues with bass bleed, I still wasn't getting a ton of instrument and vocal detail, which was a little surprising. Now, as far as instrument naturalness, it was actually pretty impressive. And while I did feel like the pinna or upper mid energy was a little too much for me and could get a little shouty at higher volumes, I think they still did a pretty decent job for this being a budget set. And I did also pick up on a little bit of graininess in the upper mids as well. So this is where some of the limitations of a budget set can start to be exposed. And again, we are talking $30, so that's no surprise there. And these are budget drivers, so they are obviously going to have their limitations. Now, as far as the treble, it does have some of the same issues carrying over from the mids into the treble as well. And while I do think the treble levels or the overall treble energy does work pretty well with the rest of the tuning and doesn't really have any major issues with its tuning, it's not the most resolving. I guess you could maybe describe it as having kind of a smoother presentation, but it doesn't sound as smooth and natural as you might expect, especially when you look at the graph. And in terms of treble detail, while acceptable for this price range, it is still somewhat lacking in my opinion. And as far as technicalities, they are also about average for this price point. So overall detail levels, again, generally speaking, are about average. The soundstage isn't necessarily wide, but it also isn't what I would really consider narrow either. It's just, again, right about average. Instrument layering and separation are okay, I guess. So in terms of technical performance, it's about what you might expect to get for $30. But to wrap this up, despite some of its limitations overall, I do still think this set is very competitive for its $30 asking price. And it is without question probably one of the best budget sets to come across my review table this year. So it does absolutely get my recommendation. And then next we have the TRN ST7, and this is about the same price as the Trio. It's $35, and it also has a very similar style presentation and packaging. So it just comes with the IEMs and cable, and then a very small assortment of ear tips. And then they do not include a case. The shell is all plastic, and it definitely does have more of a budget look and feel, but it is pretty comfortable. And you can see how they have a pretty significant curvature on the inside of the shell, and it seems to rest fairly comfortably, at least in my ears. As for the driver configuration, it does have a hybrid setup, and it uses 2 dynamic drivers and then 5 balanced armature drivers, so 7 drivers total per ear. But how does it sound? Well, this is more V-shaped in its overall presentation as opposed to the Trio's more neutral signature. That being said, the focus of the ST7's tuning is on the upper mid-range. And while I wouldn't necessarily say the ST7 is unbalanced, there's something about the way they tune the upper mids that is kind of pulling my attention that direction. But if we break things down a little more, starting with the bass, as far as bass energy, like I said, I do think my attention is kind of being drawn towards the upper mids, but at the same time, I do feel like there is enough bass energy to offset that for the most part. Now, as far as bass quality, it's actually not bad. So it does still have decent dynamics and impact, and I think the extra mid bass presence helps with that. Extension isn't bad. My issue is it's got a pretty significant amount of bass bleed, unfortunately resulting in some muddiness in the lower mid-range. So its overall bass quality is what I would consider to be about average for a budget set. And then as you move into the mids and upper mids, there is a little bit of recess in the mids right before that jump up into the mids or the pinna gain region, which does contribute to some unnaturalness in its vocal and instrument presentation. Again, a very common issue with budget sets. So then we have a pretty steep elevation into the upper mids that peaks out a little bit early at around 1.8K, and it kind of comes more to a point and it's less rounded, and then it drops off pretty significantly after that 1.8K peak. So you have a little bit of energy loss between about 2K and 8K. So you've got the dip, then kind of an early upper mid peak, and then some energy loss. And I think maybe all of that combined is contributing to some of that unnaturalness that I was picking up on. And then as you move into the treble, the energy does start to pick up some, and it also does bring a little bit of detail back into the picture. Not a lot, but it is enough to give the ST7 a little bit of a sense of clarity, at least in the top half of its presentation. And I actually think the overall treble presentation of the ST7 is pretty decent for a budget set, although I did feel at times it could become a little peaky, and I did notice cymbals could start to sound a little bit splashy on certain recordings. Now, as far as its technical performance, I would consider the ST7 to have a little wider of a soundstage, maybe a little more open sounding than the Trio. Otherwise, they're about the same on a technical level. So imaging and instrument layering aren't great, and again, are about what I would expect to see at this budget price range. And as far as whether or not I would recommend this set, well, personally, I didn't really find myself connecting with this set. The tuning just wasn't to my preference, and I just didn't feel like there were any special attributes that would make me want to reach for it over any of my other budget sets. Now, of course, there might be those out there that might hear that description and think this would work for them. Again, it just didn't work for me. So that concludes my review of the CCA Trio and TRN ST7. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.